This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, here to kick things off for this week's episode. Today, Mike flies solo talking about New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani's proposal to eliminate the city's gifted education program in the early grades, and how we might get more people on the left to support advanced learning for all students. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam Tyner reviews a new study on how parental education shapes early excellence gap among students. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And it is just me today, going solo again on the Education Gadfly Show. We're going to talk about gifted education. Let's do that on Ed Reform Update. All right, folks. Well, the reason that I want to talk about gifted education is because based on my inbox and social media feeds, at least the big education news over the past couple of weeks was Zohran Mamdani's proposal to scrap New York City's gifted education program in grades K through 2 and the fierce backlash it sparked. Now, I suspect that maybe some of you that are on the left might not have heard about this, that this discussion might have been completely invisible, which I think is telling. And one of the reasons that I want to talk about this today, because on the right, and I think also in some of the center, this has been big news, and this has really set people's hair on fire. Now, first of all, let me acknowledge something about this particular proposal. This is, after all, the Education Gadfly Show. We are policy wonks first and foremost. The proposal itself isn't necessarily all that terrible. I mean, the Big Apple, New York City, is a real outlier in starting a gifted education program at kindergarten. It's also an outlier in that, in many cases, to go to a gifted education program, these tiny tykes have to find their way to other schools outside their own neighborhood, sometimes all over the city. That's not typical. In many parts of the country, most parts of the country, as far as we can tell, gifted education starts later, maybe second grade, maybe third grade, not in kindergarten. New York Daily News former editor, Josh Greenman wrote the other day on his Substack that all of us should have some mixed feelings about this program design, this idea of starting in kindergarten. And he, by the way, is a very satisfied father of a gifted education student. So he's gone through the system. He sees how great some of these gifted programs have been, including for his own child. But he still acknowledges that it's kind of weird to start this so young. It was especially weird back a few years ago, and for many years before that, when they had 4-year-olds taking standardized tests to determine whether they would qualify for the gifted education programs. They didn't give the test to everybody. You had to sign up for it. And guess what? That test resulted in a very non-diverse group of kids doing gifted education. A much better approach, and one that our very ideologically diverse National Working Group on Advanced Education proposed back in 2023, is to provide some kind of advanced education, accelerated learning at every elementary school in the city, we would say in the country. Make sure that those programs are serving the top students in every elementary school. So that nobody has to go to another school, and so that every school, even schools whose students may not be all that high performing compared to kids across the district or across the state, across the country, but they are high performing in their school compared to their peers, to make sure that every child gets a chance to be challenged. Now, under Mayor Adams, New York City has been trying to move in this direction, trying to build more gifted education programs at more elementary schools. And they've had some success as a result of diversifying the gifted education population. A great Chalkbeat New York article about this just the other day. Okay, that's the policy wonkery. In terms of the reaction, I suspect that a lot of the people on the right and center who saw this news, they're just responding to the headlines, right? Which goes something like, socialist wants to kill gifted education. All right. Now, again, that's not completely fair. I mean, first of all, Mamdani is a social democrat, not a socialist, I think, right? And again, he doesn't want to kill gifted education necessarily, just start it later. But I can imagine that it triggered some PTSD for some folks. Again, I totally get it. It kind of harkens back to the darkest days of the Great Awakening back in the 2010s and peaking in 2020 when, this was one of the big ideas in education, was to fight systemic racism, was to fight for social justice. We needed to get rid of gifted education because it was racist, it was classist. It's not surprising, I think, that some folks on the right respond to that with a lot of anger. AEI's James Pathoukikis, is that how you say it? He wrote, "True equality shouldn't mean slowing the swift. How is that not obvious?" Or the Wall Street Journal editorial page, again, the traditional conservative stalwart quoted, "Socialism in a nutshell, a persistent fear that somebody somewhere might be getting ahead and ought to be yanked back." All right, so that's the ideological backlash from the right. Of course, there's politics. There's some hope among some of these folks that maybe this is the kind of thing that could stop Mamdani's momentum. All right, but let's get back to education reform. As somebody who is a big booster of advanced education, I don't want this issue to be so polarized. As I've said before on the show and in my writing, it is always better as an issue advocate if your issue is a bipartisan one, if there is support on both sides of the aisle. It makes for a stronger and more durable coalition. Now, look, that is not always possible. I think we have seen that, for example, in private school choice. It is just really hard to find Democrats who are comfortable with sending public money to private schools, especially religious schools that can pick and choose who they want to admit and can discriminate against LGBTQ kids or their families. All of that makes it a case where there really isn't much support on the left for that idea. And so I get it that many of the school choice groups decided to stop trying to find Democrats, at least in large numbers, to support private school choice and just lean into kind of full-throated, red meat conservative versions of school choice, as we see now universal ESAs in lots of places. Okay, but if we can get to bipartisanship, that's a better thing. And my argument is that this idea around gifted education, the notion of challenging academically talented kids, it is not something that should only rile up conservatives or neoliberals, right? The left should worry about this too, especially if we're talking about high achieving, low income kids, halo kids, right? Just talented kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, right? And certainly once these kids get older, progressive groups have been more than willing to support policies to support them. Education Trust, for example, has long been one of the leading groups pushing for expanding access to advanced courses in high school, things like advanced placement, international baccalaureate, dual enrollment. I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, note that Ed Trust, unlike, say, some people in the education schools are really on the far left, they don't make a case that nobody should be doing advanced coursework in high school, that to do any kind of separating kids into different, quote, tracks is racist or classist. They seem to acknowledge that, no, we should have these things called AP classes. They also aren't arguing that everybody should be put in AP. You've got to be ready for it. You've got to be ready to succeed. Otherwise, it's not going to do you or anybody else any good. But they do want to expand access. They worry about the data, as do I, as I'm sure many of you do, showing that there's such a disparity racially and in terms of class, so many fewer Black and Hispanic students than you would expect, even given student achievement results, that there should be, we need to do a better job finding those high achieving, low income kids, including kids from color, and make sure they know about AP, get them in there and get them challenged, right? There's also growing interest among some of these groups, including, again, Education Trust, in doing this at the middle school level. and there's this whole idea in the last couple of years about automatic enrollment into advanced courses. This started, I think, in Washington State, then Colorado, North Carolina, Texas. Policies that say, hey, if a kid scores at the advanced level on the state test, then they should automatically be enrolled in an advanced math class, and including in middle school. So if that's, algebra by the 8th grade, hey, let's make sure that's the default for those kids. And what we have seen is that it has indeed resulted in many more kids from disadvantaged backgrounds getting into those high level courses. These initiatives appear to be really popular across the ideological spectrum of education reform. Last week at the Pi Network Summit in Atlanta, one of the big Eddies Awards went to this automatic enrollment into advanced courses initiative. That was voted on by the membership of that group, which represents ed reformers all over the country and from left, right, and center. So it does seem to be that is a popular idea. So, what am I worried about, right? The left is on board with advanced education, right? Well, in middle school, yes. In high school, yes. Certainly in terms of getting more kids of color and low-income kids into college, including selective colleges, yes. But not at the elementary school level. Not if you call it gifted education. This seems to be a much harder sell. For them, we did an analysis last year, had a consultant go out, talk to a bunch of reform group leaders, education philanthropists, asking about the appetite to do something big on gifted education. And it was really disheartening. If you're talking about elementary schools, there just was no appetite for it. So what is it? What's going on? Maybe it's just the term gifted education or gifted and talented. It's got a lot of baggage. It goes back 100 years to the progressive era. It had a racist start. There's the intersection with eugenics. I mean, it's bad. There's no doubt. And there's also just rubs people the wrong way that you're going to identify some 5-year-old as gifted and some other 5-year-old as not gifted. Like all children have gifts. Well, yeah. So maybe it's the word. Maybe, though, it's also just this notion that this is too young to be identifying kids. It feels like too much sorting with young children, too deterministic, maybe. Maybe that's what's going on. But I think we got to figure this out, because here's the deal. If you don't start in elementary school, maybe it doesn't have to be kindergarten, right? Back to New York City, but pretty early in elementary school, if you don't start giving kids a chance to be challenged, they are not going to learn as much as they could. And that is especially the case for disadvantaged kids who are less likely to get opportunities for challenge outside of schools. So at least, let's say, by the 2nd or 3rd grade, we want to be identifying kids, giving them a chance, for example, math acceleration so that they will be on track for algebra by the 8th grade. Opportunity in English language arts too, to be challenged to read novels and the kinds of things that they are ready for and maybe their peers aren't ready for. We need to be doing that if we want to close the excellence gaps, if we want to build a pipeline of kids, including kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, who are ready to excel at high levels. So what can we do then to depolarize this issue of gifted education, to try to bring along more people on the left? All right, I've got a few ideas, but I really want to know from your perspective if this makes sense and what else we could be doing. Number one, drop the gifted label. Look, this is what this working group on advanced education that I mentioned earlier, you'll notice the name, advanced education. That is a much better term. That seems to resonate. Let's use that instead. The second thing is, let's really take the equity concerns seriously. So there's been some great studies on this, including by a Nobel laureate. If you do universal screening, where you use some kind of test that everybody takes to identify students, that is a much fairer way to do it, and it results in a more diverse group. It's fair because you're not saying that parents have to nominate their children for gifted education or that teachers have to give recommendations. We just know that there can be a lot of racial and class bias in that. This way, you just remove all of that. Use the 3rd grade state test, for example, or if you're using MAP or iReady in the earlier grades, you can use that. But use something where you can universally screen to identify kids. And then make sure that every elementary school in the country has some kind of advanced education program, that it doesn't have to be something that you get selected and then you leave your peers and go elsewhere. You do it in your school. and make sure that every school serves at least the top 10% of their students. Now, in some schools, most likely high poverty ones, those top 10% of students may not be all that high performing compared to the district norms or state or national averages, right? But they are higher performing than the peers in their schools, in their classrooms. And that means that if you don't go out of your way to challenge them, they are probably sitting there bored as the teachers trying to help their peers who might be at grade level or below grade level rather than above grade level. And so we've got to come up with innovative ways, again, to give them time at least every day, some part of the day, to get special challenge so that they can make that progress and compete with those other high achieving kids around the country, someday get, into the advanced courses in middle school, do well in the AP courses in high school, go on and get into selective colleges and beyond. That's how we close the excellence gap. That's how we build this pipeline that we would all like to see for this country. So those are my ideas, again, on how to depolarize gifted education. I would like to hear from you. How do we make advanced education a bipartisan issue? All right, gang, that's all I got for today. Now it's time for everyone's favorite, Adam's Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back with you.
And I need to welcome David as well, since I was going solo this week. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, better late than never, right?
That's right. Hey, man, you should go back and listen, though. It was a banger. I fired up about gifted education.
I believe you.
And we didn't even plan it. I understand that this is going to be thematically a very nice combination today. So, Adam, with that, what do you got for us?
Well, today on the Research Minute, we have a new study digging deep into a question that doesn't get nearly enough attention: how well first-generation students, those students whose parents did not attend college, are represented at the very top of the achievement scale. We hear a lot about gaps at the bottom, but this paper asks a topic that our friends Jonathan Plucker and Scott Peters have popularized, what they call excellence gaps, meaning who's reaching the highest levels of performance and how much that can vary across types of students and schools. This new NBER working paper is by a team of economists representing Columbia University, UVA, and the University of Chicago, and the paper leverages rich data from at least what used to be our favorite state to conduct education research, North Carolina, where the researchers got access to the state's longitudinal administrative files, tracking roughly 800,000 students from 3rd through 8th grade and then into high school, and linking them with their schools, teachers, test scores, and parental education levels. They include students who started 3rd grade between 1995 and 2006 and then follow them all the way into high school. So the final college entrance exam data is from 2022. Using state test score data, AP scores, and college entrance exam data, they construct the excellence gaps between students whose parents went to college. They call those continuing generation students, although it's a little bit of an awkward term, and those who did not have a parent who completed college. That's first gen students. And excellence is generally based on whether students fall into the top 10% of test scores within each grade and subject. That's reading and math, generally speaking. So their first big finding is that excellence gaps are everywhere. They show up early also. In 3rd grade, continuing generation students are about 4 times as likely as first generation students to score in the top decile in math. That's the top 10%. And those gaps are pretty stable all the way through middle school. In high school, students from more educated households take AP courses at 3 times the rate of first generation students. And the disparity is even larger when you look at STEM AP courses or whether a student took a lot of AP courses. They're also remarkably consistent across schools, although there were a tiny sliver of schools, about 3% of the North Carolina schools, where the excellence gaps were reversed. They also find that family income and school quality together explain only about a third of these gaps. The researchers try to disentangle the factors that might lead to excellence gaps, and they find that roughly 20% of the difference is explained by socioeconomic status, like family income, and another 10% is explained by the schools students attend. That leaves about 2/3 unaccounted for, meaning that there's something else, things like information, expectations, or even social networks that help students with more educated parents reach excellence while first generation students disproportionately fall short. When they look longitudinally and focus on who actually sustains excellence from the early grades through high school, persistence rates for first generation students are about 15 percentage points lower than for their continuing generation peers. Finally, the paper dives into the role of teachers. And that's where things get both a little bit hopeful, but also kind of sobering. Teachers differ a lot in their ability to produce excellence. Having a teacher one standard deviation above average in promoting math excellence increases a student's odds of reaching that level by about 3 percentage points. And that sounds small, but it's actually a lot since excellence is defined as being in the top 10%. Those effects ripple forward. Students lucky enough to have those teachers early on are also more likely to take AP exams, get the top score on an AP exam, and make plans for college years later. The study also finds that some teachers seem to have a comparative advantage for first generation students, especially in reading, meaning that teacher assignment policies could potentially narrow some of these excellence gaps if they were used intentionally. So the big takeaway, and I'll end with this, is that gaps in academic excellence are real, large, and persistent, and they cannot be chalked up to just poverty or school funding. That parental education really matters.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Well, like I said, this does pair nicely with what I was talking about earlier, which was Mamdani's proposal to get rid of gifted education in New York City in the earliest grades. And as we talked about, look, it is really important if you want to prime the pipeline of kids who are ready for advanced coursework to start early. Maybe not as early as New York's been doing it. Kindergarten is really early, but pretty early, sometime in elementary school.
Is he talking about getting rid of it in other grades beyond kindergarten?
No, just in those earliest grades, which is not sort of well known if you just have glance at the headlines. A lot of the reaction made it sound like he was out to kill gifted education writ large. But look, the hopefulness here is important. Great teachers matter, right? That there's some ability to get kids from non-college households to have these opportunities. But a lot of it is, kind of sobering, right? That kids from educated households have a huge advantage. I'm interested that these NBER folks mentioned social networks as one possible mechanism for that, information. They didn't mention the most obvious thing, which, again, I was just talking about how do we get the left on board with gifted education. So I'm about to totally shoot myself in the foot on that effort right now when I say, isn't like maybe genetics here possibly a factor at the individual level? Like, maybe if your parents were good at school and went to college, that makes it you think maybe likely that maybe you're going to be good at school and go to college because you were lucky enough to be born with genes, that express themselves in that way. David, true or false?
It's obviously true, but we don't talk about it, Mike. I don't necessarily even have to go there, though, right? I mean, anybody who thinks that, I don't know, whatever our really sort of crude measures of socioeconomic status are fully capturing culture or class or the kind of human capital that comes with education is just kind of, I don't know, maybe there are some, I doubt even researchers believe that. Let's be real. I think there are lots of very educated people who don't necessarily go to Wall Street. They are passing this along. It's not even clear what we mean by this, right? It's just sort of it's probably about content knowledge. It's probably just I think an understanding of how the world works, right? In terms of how to do well in school and sort of what it takes, right, to continue to excel in school, how to get to college, right? I mean, the message for me from this is, right, like it's starting kind of early, right? And it's not like, I mean, it's not just about what happens, when you graduate from high school, right? It's starting before then. And if we want to fix it, we have to start early too. And I think all education people honestly know this, Mike. I don't know that I would consider this a controversial conclusion, right? Honestly, I think people on both sides of the aisle understand this. They just talk about it in different ways.
And look, and I don't want people to walk away with this feeling like there's nothing we can do about this. It's all deterministic, right? We know from this study, we know from studies that we've done in Ohio about gifted education. We actually have a new study coming down the pike from Ohio. That, look, for example, low-income kids of color, much less likely to be identified for gifted education services than you would expect, not only given, sort of their representation of the population, but based on their test scores, right? That there are high-achieving kids of color or low-income kids who don't get identified for gifted ed, and their more affluent or white and Asian peers scoring the same on those tests do, right? So identifying them, making sure they get services, hey, that can make a big difference, right? Like you said, Adam, finding those teachers who are really good at nurturing excellence and making sure that poor kids of color have access to those teachers also in at least equal amounts. I mean, so there are some things we can do. Now, it's not going to dramatically change the picture, right? It's not like we're suddenly going to see no relationship between parental education levels and the outcomes for kids, but it's going to mean that we're going to do a better job identifying those students out there who have the potential to achieve at high levels who might otherwise be overlooked.
I gotta say, going from like third grade all the way to high school and seeing the persistence of the gaps, and it's a little depressing. At the same time, third grade is like, kid is like 8 years old. This is like a lot of life has happened up until then. And so I think there's probably, there's a lot of stuff that can happen before third grade that we can probably intervene on too. But I mean, I don't know. A lot of kids do kind of seem like they're on their path to some extent by that point. That's why we have in some states, we have, third grade reading guarantees and stuff. We want to make sure that you're at a certain level by that point. But early elementary, I mean, there's a lot going on there, and obviously even before that. But I don't discount your genetic idea, Mike. Surely there's a part of it that's just not very actionable for us.
Yeah. All right. And look, it sounds like Adam wants to really go and fight Mamdani in New York and make sure that kindergartners there still get access to gifted ed. Again, it's just unusual. I mean, there's not that many places in America where you can go where they actually have gifted education programs for kindergartners, but hey, maybe we should need more of them.
I think it's worth noting too, Mike, just that this part of the distribution, right, it is, any difference in averages, right, is going to lead to big differences in proportions in the extremes, right? So, you could also just improve education generally for the kids of, what are we calling them? First generation kids, right? And we'll expect to see an improvement on the extremes.
That is very nicely said. We will leave it there, David. Thank you, Adam, for a great one. And we will see you next week for the last Adam's Research Minute, at least in your time here at Fordham. So we expect it to be a really great one.
Gotta be a banger.
Another banger.
Yeah, I got to think about that. Please send me your articles that I haven't already seen on the NBR website or whatever, because I don't know what I'm going to do it about.
All right. Dan Goldhaber out there, pitch Adam something. Come on. All right. Until next week.
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.